February has passed and I am now a year older, so with this new wisdom, let me tell you about the games I played throughout the month. I had a strong start with Bramble the Mountain King. Pulling from Nordic folklore and not the watered down, easy to digest Disney friendly version, but rather the brutal and horrific original tales, it sets your character in a magical world and tasks him with finding his sister, all while doing whatever he possibly can to avoid the countless creatures that either want to eat him or steal his soul. At a glance, it resembles titles like Little Nightmares, and I think if you like those games, you'll almost certainly like this as well. But I would say it does a fair bit more with perspective and camera angles, allowing it to occupy its own space within the same genre. In general, the presentation here is incredible. The world is gorgeous, and the designs of the creatures are disturbing. The set pieces are all unique and thrilling, and it exceeds at creating that joyous feeling of barely getting away. Sometimes judging depth can be a bit janky, which may lead to a death or two, but frankly, I didn't find this to be a problem very often, and I've had far more janky experiences with other titles in the genre. What might be the best part of the game's presentation is its music. It always seems to know just how to make a moment impactful. Some tracks are diegetic, some are timed to the action, and it all connects the whole experience in a wonderful way. This is one of those games that after beating, you'll want to have your friends come over to play so you can watch them beat it. Now, it is a title where the gameplay largely takes a backseat to the spectacle, but based on its length and the high quality of its spectacle, I definitely think it works here. Had it been any longer than it was, the mechanics would have felt a bit stretched thin, but I felt like it ended exactly when it needed to in order to avoid that feeling, and still managed to be satisfying. Yeah, I really like this one, and I imagine it's the kind of game I will replay on a nice crisp fall day. Then I played FlyKnight with Iron Pineapple and Maria of Eurothug 4000 fame for another video that will be on Pine's channel someday. Probably. Maybe. Inspired by old school dungeon crawlers, FlyKnight has an undeniably nostalgic feel to it. It looks like RuneScape and plays like the games you were never able to actually beat as a kid, but it also does a lot that feels incredibly modern. Every enemy you face doesn't just have a single health bar, they also have limbs that will fall off once they've taken enough damage, which not only is funny, but also can turn the tide of any given fight in your favor, making it an important focus for every battle. Different enemies and even different parts of enemies are vulnerable to different types of damage, so while I definitely did favor certain weapons, I still found myself swapping between them pretty regularly to always maintain an advantage. I liked that a lot because not every game gives you reasons to use different weapons. Also, depending on what way you're moving, the direction of your attacks will change as well. It is a surprisingly deep system, and every weapon and spell you come across feels different enough from the last where you'll always be compelled to check them out. Furthermore, the fact that it can be played co-op adds a whole new layer of depth to it. It completely changes the dynamics of fights, largely by making them easier, but a lot of thought still goes into every battle, as unless you equip a ring that disables friendly fire, which we obviously didn't do, going in and swinging without thought will lead to you just killing your friends. So you still have to think a lot about what weapon type to use and where to swing from in order to be as effective as possible. This leads to a ton of chaotic fun, and yeah, it was just an utter blast to explore the underground with Pine and Maria. I've not gone back to do a full playthrough on my own yet, but I do plan to at some point, as it really is a different experience and one that I think I'd have a lot of fun with. Now, it definitely is a game that's timing and movement takes some getting used to, and I know all games are kind of like that, but due to the general sluggishness of gameplay here, I'd say it takes a little more getting used to. It also is kind of buggy, no pun intended. Actually, it was intended. I wrote it in the script, as well as this line saying I wrote it in the script. So, everything is an illusion. Do not trust anyone. Anyway, stuff just doesn't work sometimes, but luckily we didn't run into any issues that had a significant impact on our experience. Most of it was just small, kind of annoying stuff. Ultimately, it is a weird and fun game that you can play with friends and costs $6, so it's a pretty easy one to recommend. After that, I finally got around to Momodora Moonlit Farewell, a title I've been meaning to play since it came out at the beginning of 2024, but I kept putting off for one reason or another. I really enjoyed its predecessor, Reverie Under the Moonlight, so I had fairly high expectations for this one, and in some ways it actually exceeded them. The environments, the layout of each area, the basic enemy encounters, the sprites, it all feels bigger and better. The game just has a lot more polish and is pretty easy to understand and get into. Unfortunately, as someone who can't help but compare it to Reverie Under the Moonlight, I found some of the changes they made to make the game more approachable to a wider audience to be disappointing. For instance, it is far more linear than Reverie. The next step is almost always clear, which takes some of the fun out of exploration. The whole middle chunk of Reverie can be done in any order, and I love Metroidvanias that do that. It's just a cool amount of freedom. As for quality of life features, they added a magic bar and a stamina bar and included numbers for everything, even damage you deal, and it ends up creating a lot of visual clutter that isn't really necessary. I also think the inclusion of stamina creates some issues, especially with traversal, as there ends up being a decent bit of backtracking in the middle of the game. Constantly focusing on the stamina bar gets pretty annoying. I always want my backtracking to be as painless as possible, and it definitely is a bit painful here. They also did away with the spell items and replaced them with a sigil system that operates very similarly to charms in Hollow Knight, and I do think it mostly works, but as they are all pretty much passive abilities, I found myself missing some of the more active ones of the previous game. Also, as I have now fully dedicated to being stuck in the past, one change I felt really disappointed by was that they no longer gave out a reward for beating a boss without taking damage. This was an aspect I really loved in Reverie, as it brought a whole new level of challenge to each fight, and as I was someone who enjoyed speedrunning the game, learning how to beat the bosses without taking damage became imperative, as it gave access to items that made it possible to beat the game far quicker. Now, as I've stated before on the main channel, I do think that putting items and weapons that make the game easier behind the hardest challenges in a title is kind of goofy, as it is rewarding players who don't really need the help, so I do understand why they made this change. But as someone who played the previous game in a very specific way, I did kind of wish it had been in here, as I think I would have ended up spending far more time with it than I did. All in all, Moonlit Farewell is a very capable and fun Metroidvania, and it is probably a better entry point into the series for newcomers. However, it lacks some of the edges that made Reverie Under the Moonlight such a memorable experience for me. I think people without that baggage will have a great time with it. To end things off, I played Blacktail, a title inspired by Slavic folklore, primarily focusing on the origins of Baba Yaga. Pretty early on, I was struck by how ambitious this title is. It contains a lot of ideas and mechanics that I was surprised to see in a game of this size. There's crafting for both consumables like arrows and potions to help you in fights, and also for permanent upgrades to your core abilities. Pretty much every enemy drops a specific resource, incentivizing players to regularly engage in combat. There also is a morality system, allowing you to either be a savior or a menace, and depending on the way you lean, you get access to different abilities. One part of the system I found to be really interesting is that there are a few different morality trackers. There is a big general one that weighs your good and bad actions, but then there are also ones tied to more specific actions, and completing them gives you a title that largely allows you to just unlock specific chests, but the concept itself is pretty cool. Like, to complete the good side of one of the tracks, you have to kill birds, which is seen as an evil action, while still maintaining your overall good rating, creating a balance where you actually have to do some evil things in order to ultimately be good. In a lot of games that have morality systems, it is pretty easy to just always pick the good thing or the bad thing depending on how you want to play, so I like that this additional meter created a temptation to actually do evil deeds. It also made me pay more attention to my morality meter so as not to dip into the other side. Admittedly, this system doesn't have the most interesting payoffs, but I did think parts of it were clever and would love to see more games iterate on some of the ideas here. Blacktail also has a semi-open world. There are 4 major areas that you unlock as you move through the story, and each is a pretty sizable space that you can explore non-linearly, completing quests, both main and side, fighting bosses, and exploring the points of interest littered throughout the map. There really is a ton to engage with. Every part of the world is densely packed with stuff to do. It's also straight out of a fairy tale beautiful. The environments are a joy to walk through, and anyone who likes games where you're in nature will feel right at home here. Now, while there are many things within the game to explore, pretty much everything you encounter, from quests to camps to caves to chests just laying around, end in combat. Which, like, yeah, duh, that's how gameplay loops work. But the problem is the combat really isn't that good. Bow combat in games is tricky, and while I do think it can be a good supplement to other weapons, when it is your only option, things start to feel pretty limited. Nearly every fight plays out the same way. You shoot an enemy from afar, then place the broom item, which aggroes them, and then you take a few steps back and shoot them until you either put down a new broom or they die. There are 3 different types of arrows, and you don't unlock one of them until fairly late in the game, and it all just leads to pretty stale feeling fights. There really just needed to be more to it, whether it be more enemy variety, more spells, or more arrow types. Like an arrow that acts as a grappling hook would have gone a long way. If you just focus on the main quest, the issues with the combat probably won't be too noticeable, but as exploring the world really is the coolest part of the game, skipping past most of it would come with its own issues. Also, you'd probably be underpowered as a lot of the upgrades are locked behind recipe pages that you get from doing side quests. I do actually think this kind of approach would be cool if the side quests were great, but most of them aren't all that special, and after a while I found myself skipping past them as I was getting fatigued by the combat. This also made it so I felt less incentivized to explore the later areas, as collecting materials had no real purpose if I couldn't use them to unlock anything. I'd argue that the game ends up being a bit longer than it needed to be, and part of this feeling comes from the game's story. There is a lot of dialogue, and I didn't care for most of it. To be clear, I don't think that the voice acting itself is bad. In fact, there are a lot of great actors in this who gave solid performances. It's just that a lot of the lines felt too long and unimportant to anything that was going on. Also, as conversations are just static shots of the character you're talking to, it leaves a bit to be desired in terms of visual stimulation. One thing that's unfortunate is that I actually think there's a lot of really good writing in here, but it's covered by a fair bit of fluff. All in all, Blacktail is an interesting game, and I think that's worth something. It's the kind of title that made me want to study its mechanics. Ultimately though, it stretches a bit beyond what it can support, creating something that is impressive yet kind of tiring to play once you get past the opening few hours. I imagine though that someone more patient might really love it. Anyway, that's all I got. See you next time, unless I decide to stop doing this. Peace.